The history of the River Kingdoms. For untold millennia, the River Kingdoms were mostly untouched by the powers of the ancient world. Here, in north-central Avestan, the presence of the Serpent Folk, the Empire of Aslant, and even the Avestinian civilization of Thassalon was too far removed from the River Kingdoms to affect it. Although it is said the ruins of a group of Aslanti exiles can be found in the Echowood, so perhaps that isn't entirely true. One ancient civilized people that did explore these lands in the early prehistory of the world were the Elves, who had arrived in the nearby kingdom of Keonan sometime during the Age of Serpents. In their exploration, they discovered that fey creatures had made their home in the Wildwood north of Keonan. At some point during that time, they had constructed 7 magical arches in a clearing in the wood. Tens of thousands of years ago, these arches were powerful gates to strange places, including the First World, and the Elves used them freely when they learned of them, and made compacts with the powerful fey creatures of the Wildwood to access them. After the Earthfall Cataclysm, the fey keepers of the arches disappeared, and the arches fell into disuse. Time and nature have challenged but not defeated the arches. Vines climb the sides, and moss half covers the stone carvings of animals and magical beasts. During the ages of darkness and anguish, the River Kingdoms were for a long time the realm of warring Kelid warlords. As the Kelids kept poor records of how these lands were won and fought during these ancient times, the only accurate recorded history of the River Kingdoms actually begins in the year 37, close to the dawn of the Age of Enthronement, when the Taldans first came to the River Kingdoms, and brought the light of southern civilization to the northern barbarians, and with it a more accurate written record. This is where our story really begins. In the year 37, Taldans conquered the lands of Galt, Keonan, and modern-day Seven Arches, during a campaign that would be called the First Army of Exploration, led by the famous General Porthmos. The Taldan explorers set up outposts all along the Selin River, but especially along the shores of Lake and Carthan, recognizing that these fertile lands would make a good staging ground for further exploration. Taldan control solidified in these early conquered territories for a few hundred years, while the Empire focused its expansions around the Great Lake. By 499, a second army of exploration conquered much of the western river kingdoms, including the lands that would be the modern-day kingdoms of Timon, Lambreth, half of Daggermark, and the Echowood, as well as the lands of modern-day Rezmiran and Ustalav. In 1575, in the Taldan-occupied province of Seven Arches, some of the arches began acting up. They had become somehow mistuned, perhaps leading to the other world realms, and began to disgorge evil monstrosities known as the Gorgus. Gorgus came in a bewildering variety of animalistic shapes, but all had teeth, claws, and eyes of pure shadow. Taldan soldiers fought alongside fey creatures from the Wildwood, including dryads, satyrs, but especially a large group of treants, to contain the first emergence of the Gorgus. The First Alliance would set the stage for the later establishment of the Oak Stewards. From 2009 to 2014, Taldor's Fifth Army of Exploration extended the Empire north, through Rossland and Issia, to the shores of the Lake of Mists and Veils. Effectively, Taldor occupied the entirety of the modern river kingdoms, and more lands besides. Towards the end of the Fifth Army's conquests, a Taldan gladiator named Maldar Timon, a star of the Apara arena, joined the army. He and his squad of gladiators felt the need to test their mettle against the barbaric Kelids of the north that they had heard so much about. In 2021, in return for his heroism, Maldar was given a piece of land that included much of the Exalted Wood and the mandate to rule this land for Taldor. He set about building the town of Timon, and many of his fellow soldiers stayed on to tame the wilderness. Maldar's intent was to create a beacon for gladiators everywhere to come to Timon, hone their skills, and achieve fame and fortune, and for the prefecture to be ruled by an exalted champion, the greatest champion of the prefecture, which he considered himself to be. To this end, he established the law of succession. The law was simple. Any fighter who had won 100 battles in the arena could challenge the champion to a one-on-one duel to the death, with the winner becoming the new champion. Maldar Timon was succeeded by an elven gladiator named Karth Valkanar, not long after establishing the law of succession. The duel of succession, however, was not held in public view of the town, but in a secret ceremony in the heart of Timon Keep, ostensibly so none could interfere with the outcome. Few suspected the truth, however, that Timon himself had struck a bargain with the druid to reincarnate him into a newer, younger body, and that Carth Valkanar was none other than Maldar Timon himself, reborn. In 2057, Maldar, under his new alias of Carth, established the Valkanar Gladiatorial College in Timon. The Gladiatorial College is one of the best outside of Apara and draws from all over northern Avestan those who want to test their mettle in the arena. In 2361, after the first defeat of the Whispering Tyrant, King Soyvidia Ustav united the nation of Ustalav and struck an agreement with the Taldan Empire to recognize the borders of their kingdom and the empire along the length of the West Selen River. In 2632, the elves returned to Kionin, defeating the demon Tree Raiser and then turning their attention to the Taldan humans who occupied their lands. After a few bloody skirmishes, the Taldans retreated from the ancestral elven lands. In 2690, the elves also attempted to reconquer Seven Arches, where they knew their ancestors had made use of the Fey Gates of the ancient world. They were repelled, however, by an alliance of Treants and Druids, the same group who had established themselves to watch for the return of the Gorgus. 2 years later, that alliance of Druids, Treants, and other Fey creatures formally took the name the Oak Stewards, considering themselves the protectors of the Taldan prefecture of Seven Arches. In 2802, Kionin elves established Himbria as a base to launch another ultimately unsuccessful bid to reclaim Seven Arches. They retained control of Himbria, however, and Taldans largely withdrew from the surrounding lands, creating a largely uncolonized and unsettled region north of Gult. In 3203, the Whispering Tyrant returned to life, conquering the lands of Ustalav. For more details on this conflict with the Tyrant, please refer to my Ustalav video. In 3756, a priest of Arden named Father Theodric founded the city of Habar, which his settlers hoped would become the capital of the newly established Emberbow prefecture. Fearing the settlement on the opposite shore would become independent and cause Habar to lose its regional political clout, the town's first mayor, Joseph, ordered the construction of a bridge to span the river without interfering with river traffic. The townsfolk completed the work about 50 years later, using a combination of hard labor, magic, and clever engineering. The Great Bridge, also called Joseph's Bridge, became a symbol of and a monument to Habar Undivided. In 3811, the Fae of the Wildwood, under the supervision from the Oak Stewards, performed their first wilding. Fae of all sizes streamed out of the forest and inhabited civilized Seven Arches for 2 weeks. The Oak Stewards informed the wild Fae they would punish and repel all Fae that caused too much harm. This is now a tradition, and the Wildwood Fae repeat this every 100 years. In 3827, the Whispering Tyrant was once again defeated, although the formerly Ustalavi provinces of Genoit and Melkat remained separate from the rest of Ustalav, becoming the independent Archduchy of Melkat. In 4071, the Taldan prefecture of Alban, modern-day Lambeth, was overrun by goblins who called their lands the Kingdom of Zog. A dynasty of 7 Barghests using the name of Zog held sway there for almost 150 years. In 4081, Governor Aspects the Even-Tongued of Cheliax broke away from the Taldan Empire. He severed the province's ties to Taldor and declared himself king. His initial claim included all Taldan territories along the Inner Sea west of the Selen River, and he later claimed Isger and Galt through threat of force in the so-called Even-Tongued Conquest. The various territories north of Galt splintered into the fractious river kingdoms of today, as well as Rossland and Issia in the north. In a single decade, Taldor's empire was shattered, and its holdings reduced to a quarter of what it controlled at its height. Also, early in the 5th century, dubbed the Deep Sea War of 4118 to 4247, far removed from the river kingdoms, deep under the oceans of the Inner Sea, a Sahagan state was gradually losing a protracted war against an aggressive merfolk empire. The Sahagan were losing, so they enacted an ambitious plan. They would send an elite battalion of Sahagan allies and mercenaries north against their enemy's stronghold by the coast in Conqueror's Bay, and they would get there overland. How? Their army would travel stealthily in a town-sized bubble of brine, held together by secret aboleth magic and other strange means, and travel by means of the freshwater rivers. but the merfolk heard of this plan, and they headed them off at the largest body of salt water between them and the saboteurs, Lake and Carthan. The two sides met in the lake. The Sahagan retreated east past the Isle of Terror, upriver by Zur, into the swamps and tributaries of what would become the River Kingdoms. The merfolk pursued them, despite also being mostly saltwater dependent, using their own magics to navigate the rivers, each side pounding the other in a brutal, exhausting fight. The two forces were lost, hundreds of miles from home, and beginning to realize they wouldn't make it back. Those few on either side who could tolerate fresh water had long abandoned the mission. Those who remained were all saltwater dependent. Eventually, both sides' magics began to break down. Without a ceasefire, they would all soon be dead. They asked their former enemies to let bygones be bygones, so that all the sea dwellers could work together to survive in the freshwater. They collaborated, grudgingly at first, combining magics with desperate energy to keep the life-saving seawater from dissipating. In 42-47, they managed to cooperate enough to build the city of Outsea. Outsea comprised a town, farmlands, rivers, and canals, pools and swampland, all in the River Kingdoms, all saturated with seawater. Where the fresh water and salt meet, Outsea's edges are maintained by walls and a complicated combination of magic and beautifully engineered water gates, locks, and sluices that keep the distinct waters from bleeding into each other, though there's always a bit of brackish overspill into the wider rivers. Meanwhile, the period following the dissolution of the Taldan Empire in the north saw many curious pockets of Taldan nobility, either trying to create their own kingdoms or trying to conquer established ones. One example of this was the Intelporium, a minor but powerful Taldan noble family of wizards, who made a surprise push to take 7 arches from the Oak Stewards. Arcane mercenaries took and held 7 arches for 9 weeks in 42-56 before the Oak Stewards reasserted control. In 42-17, the Yellow Tongue sickness ravaged the goblin ranks of the kingdom of Zog. The goblins were overthrown by a loose coalition of rivermen, half-elves, and adventurers, who formed the new kingdom of Lambeth, although it was not a united kingdom at all, but a loose collection of small towns and villages. The largest, the ramshackle pirate haven of Troxel on the Selin River, was the theoretical seat of power, but effectively exerted very little control over the surrounding region. In 42-71, the growing number of half-elves living among human settlers in eastern Himbria led to the Himbrian split, with the full-blood elves migrating mainly to western Himbria, and especially into the capital city of Mimir. Novaboro became the capital of the new half-elven nation-state of Cordelon. In 43-12, a number of brigands from nearby Brevoy sought sanctuary amid the forests of the River Kingdoms. The most famed of these brigands, a rogue with sorcerer's powers born with the name Cesare Catane, but better known as the Silver Fox, took to hiding his band of vicious thieves in a riverside hamlet known as Pitax. Within 20 years, the hamlet grew into a grand town and became the capital of the River Kingdom of Pitax. In 43-16, the inhabitants of the city of Miéville died or fled, claiming that the trees and brambles came alive to threaten them. Miéville lay empty for 20 years. In 43-28, the city of Troxel burned to the ground after a tavern brawl erupted into a full-fledged riot. Lambeth lost all sense of cohesion, and over the next few hundred years, various families who settled in or founded various cities would attempt to exert control over the region of Lambeth. The first of these was the Cullertons, who are considered Lambeth's oldest great family. In 43-55, they founded the city of Machinel at the confluence of the Selin and Ptolemida rivers. Shortly thereafter, in 43-94, the Angelidus family demolished the burned ruins of Troxel to found the new city of Lockridge. Daggermark, the city of assassins, was founded in 4402 by the tattered remnants of the assassin army of His Supreme Highness Aphanasi Athanasius from the destroyed city-state of Yenchebur, deep inside the interior of Casmarin. As his people fled the firestorm that destroyed his beloved home, Athanasius vowed to build a new city, one that kept his people safe through the 3 precepts of the assassins: life, death, and the vessel between. After battling his way through the nations of Casmarin, shrugging off skirmishes in Brevoy, and leading his people through the bandit-infested river kingdoms, Athanasius finally came to a small town on a hill overlooking the Selin River. It had everything he needed: ample farmland, river access to the sea, and a defensible position. He gave the residents of the small town, then called Rivermark, the choice to flee, join, or die. Most joined. Here, Athanasius and his followers established a school for assassins, plainly called the Daggermark Assassins' Guild, that trained anyone willing to be taught in the methods of the Enshabur warriors. This nearly lost art was a rare fighting style comprised of stealth, agility, and secrecy that turned man or woman into a holy warrior called the Vessel Between. So named because the Enshabur quietly escort their targets from the kingdom of the living to the kingdom of the dead. In 4424, the last of Lambeth's great families, the wealthy Viscara family, established the city of Sesgin. In the following years, Sesgin, Lockridge, and Machinel had their fortunes wax and wane as they each vied for power over the region of Lambeth. In 4434, Mayor Endon of Habar, looking for a way to increase revenue, decided to tax travel through the city by river. Below the Great Bridge he built the River Gate to control ships moving through Habar. Unrest among travelers grew quickly at the sudden limitation and taxation of their movement, which in turn made the townsfolk unhappy because it disrupted trade. Then came the Black Sisters of Girona, with their poisoned tongues and whispers of hate. The witches took a people who were already unhappy and whipped them into a fury, and pointed them at their neighbors. Before the year was out, the city was at war with itself, and by the end of the following summer, everyone was dead or gone, and the river gate was destroyed. To the superstitious in the river kingdoms, the fall of Habar is remembered as a lesson of what happens to those who disrupt the river freedoms, although in fact those freedoms would not be codified for another 150 years. These people believed that by building the river gate, Habar violated the third river freedom, and in doing so brought about the gate's own destruction, a manifestation of some curse, or perhaps the fate of any city that defies the river freedoms. Far in the northeast, in 4499, Coral the Conqueror came down from the Lake of Mists and Veils to conquer and unify both Issia and Rossland. Although he laid waste to much of Rossland, he worked out an agreement with Lord Nikos Surtova of Issia. The two men staked out a truce that was bound with a promise of Nikos' daughter, Myrna Surtova, in marriage to Coral. In the agreement, House Surtova kept much of its power and wealth, while they served as vassals under Coral's leadership. As a result, Issia survived the transition into the new nation of Brevoy far better than Rossland did, eventually allowing it to regain control of the nation. The next year, several Eldori families, fleeing Carl the Conqueror's invasion of Rossland, moved in to occupy the formerly abandoned city of Miéville. The Eldori were famed for their dueling swords. The dueling sword is a 3 to 3.5 foot long sword with a slightly curved blade. Although first developed by weaponsmiths in Ayabaria, it is the signature weapon of the Eldori Sword Lord, a fighting school from the region of Rossland in the nation of Brevoy. A wielder of the Eldori dueling sword relies more on speed than strength to injure their opponents. Unlike many precision blades, an Eldori dueling sword can also be effectively wielded with two hands, and those trained in its use are equally comfortable in its one-handed or two-handed stance. The Eldori traditions would continue to be taught and honed in the new kingdom of Miéville. In the region of Lambeth in 4502, fearing annexation by stronger rivals, after 10 years of delicate negotiations, Leoda Cullerton proposed a union of the three families, gathering among them all of the isolated villages between the Selin to the west and the Ptolemida to the east. They would rule as the Triunes of Lambeth, a three-family oligarchy. Still no match for the raw power of Daggermark or Timon, Lambeth's wealth and political and trade connections, especially with northern lands further up the Selin, did grant them a modicum of security. In 4534, the Eldori consolidated their control of Miéville and nearly succeeded in conquering Pitax, opening a long period of hostility between the two river kingdoms. A Pitaxian sellsword named Pieter Liasenza led the armies of Miéville into a trap at Wolf's Ravine, slaughtering Miéville's forces and marking the Liasenza family's rise to power in Pitax. In 4602, Pitax retaliated, attacking Miéville with hired mercenaries. Upon discovering that the mercenary captains intended to take Miéville for themselves, Pitax betrayed its own forces, allowing them to be destroyed by Miéville's soldiers. In 4604, a priestess of Arden named Sirona attempted to resettle Habar, but she and her warriors were slain by the Black Sisters of Girona and became undead spirits haunting the city. In 4607, Galton silk merchants founded Nistra. The group of greedy merchants, led by Count Nis, for whom the city was named, established the citadel town and subjugated the silk goyles that dwelt in the high crags. These creatures, resembling insect-like gargoyles, lay eggs and hatch young that grow into man-sized silkworm caterpillars before metamorphosing into their adult gargoyle-like form. Carefully harvesting the silk from the boiled cocoons of the giant larvae, the merchants grew wealthy from their monopoly on the abundant silk. In 4612, the first civil war between the Catanais and Liacenza families broke out in Pitax, splitting it into the rival kingdoms of Corven in the north, ruled by the Catanais family, with support from the Numerian warlords, and Pitax in the south, ruled by the Liacenza family, with the support of their vast wealth due to the rich and fertile farms and orchards located around the town of Sarrain. In 4619, a Chelish poisoner settled in Daggermark. Count Ambras Imre was escaping the turmoil of his homeland, seeking a place to practice his illegal art. In no time after arriving, he'd established the Daggermark Poisoners Guild, allied himself with the Yenchibura, the Daggermark's Assassins Guild, after agreeing to teach them his methods, of course, and possibly killed the last king of Daggermark, for within a few months of Imre's arrival, His Supreme Highness Athanasius XIII choked to death at dinner and was unresurrectable. Thereafter, Daggermark fell into anarchy, led by no one but occasionally organized through mob rule or at least widespread consent. This allowed Daggermark to function for a while, but stagnated the city's growth, and the lack of an organized military in the city led to the rise of banditry. During this ensuing upheaval, the two guilds, the Poisoners Guild and the Assassins Guild, organized things a great deal from their end. They also sent emissaries to all the regions of the River Kingdoms, suggesting a council be formed to address larger issues that might affect multiple kingdoms. They dubbed this the Outlaw Council. And the year after Athanasius's death, despite the chaos of the City of Assassins, the Outlaw Council met for the first time and officially codified the 6 river freedoms, which had already held informal sway for generations. These freedoms are detailed later in the video. In 4636, dwarves constructed the fortress of Rookwarden in the Rookwarden Fells in the northern river kingdoms. Built of solid granite by dwarven masons, this fortress had high walls and was easily defended by even a small number of skilled warriors. The marble cut here was of peerless quality, easily fetching double the normal market price in nearby Galt. In 4637, the infamous Ulfan Skald Birgi Uringen founded the town of Uringen. Birgi Uringen and his wizard companion Rona Ambrose began construction of Uringen's famous clock tower. The clock tower was a massive device, built following instructions in a stolen manuscript on time-altering magic. Due to improper assembly, curious tinkering, or arcane power surges from the ancient Fey circle beneath its foundations, the device malfunctioned when first activated and brought the tower and its immediate surroundings into a pocket dimension partially outside of time, lodged between Galarian and the First World. This temporally unstuck area encompassed the central third of the town. This event triggered other curious arcane oddities. Uringen makes itself difficult to find, so that it never seems to be exactly where it's supposed to be. The woodsmen of Embeth Forest, despite their refusal to enter the town, remain the most reliable source of directions to Uringen. The quiet nomads act as guides for people seeking the town, managing to eke out a basic living with the bartered proceeds from their service. In 4657, the elven swordsman Neyrel, a traveler from Kionin, came to the River Kingdoms to explore the ruins of Seven Arches in secret. He chanced to engage the services of a guide who was a worshipper of Hunspur. One night, the guide chose to drown Neyrel as an offering to the water rat, and as the elf flailed and fought for breath and life, he heard a watery voice speak to him, and saw visions of a lakeside community serving Hunspur. Invigorated by the voice of Hunspur, Neyrel surged from the waters of the Selin and drowned his would-be murderer. Now calling himself Neyrel the Twice-Born, once a woman, again of water, Neyrel began preaching Hunspur's word, and eventually gathered a small group of followers around him, who established a camp on the shore near their god's floating temple in Callus Lake. Meanwhile, in Daggermark, things continued to get worse in the wake of King Athanasius's death. When thousands starved to death in the winter of 4657 to 4658, the people started to grumble that maybe bringing back authoritarian rule wouldn't be such a bad thing. There was particular fear of threat from the outside as well, as Daggermark, without a king, no longer had a standing army. Hearing this, the Assassins' Guild took matters into their own hands, enacting the law of fair hire, allowing anyone to hire a student assassin to kill anyone else in the city once per year, though you couldn't target a member of the military for assassination. As the city lacked an official military, the people immediately recognized that forming one and joining it would be a good idea, if only to prevent some angry neighbors from ordering their deaths. Over time, this odd system of assassination-ruled chaos resulted in a semi-stable society. In a given month, 5 citizens of Daggermark region die from assassination or poisoning, but murder and similar violent crime are rare, and property crimes are nearly unheard of within city walls. Incentivized by protection from assassination, Daggermark also began to maintain a 1,500-person army of heavy footmen and cavalry. In 4661, Sibylla Catanay and Raymond Yasenza wed, reuniting Pitax and Corven into the single nation of Pitax. By 4663, wealth and greed had turned the Silk Lords of Nistra into cruel and callous men, prone to playing strange and often depraved games with the hearts and lives of their townsfolk. One such game resulted in the death of the family of Tharl Grimul, a Taldan druid who helped control the larval silkgoyles and was frequently out of town rounding up strays. Rather than throwing away his life in a direct attack on the merchants, Tharl plotted a slow revenge on his employers. Tharl cultivated a violet musk creeper, which when it bloomed in Nistra, dozens of violet flowers opened simultaneously and released a sweet pollen that entranced all who were near it, boring into their heads and turning them into yellow musk zombies. As the other townsfolk turned to flee, dozens of silkgoyles that the druid had freed swarmed the citadel, snatching up villagers and returning them to the violet creeper. Nistra was destroyed, and none of the Silk Lords escaped with their lives. Today the creeper has overgrown all of Nistra, creating a dark briar of vines and mulberry trees, all festooned with curious violet flowers. The silkgoyles, immune to the powers of the plant, guard their new home, hiding amid the thorns and the ruins of the human homes, sometimes idly sifting through the bones and treasures of their former masters. Nistra was not the only Riverland city to experience tragedy. The following year, in 4664, a family of Merrow, amphibious aquatic ogres, moved into the lake upriver of Mosswater. 2 weeks later, they attacked the town. The few survivors mentioned pale, glowing, ogre-like creatures wearing bone armor and wielding massive hooks, which they used to spit townsfolk and drag them back into the water. Over the years, several foreign merchants attempted to reclaim their holdings in the town, but the Merrow made quick work of anyone foolish enough to overstay their welcome. In 4668, the dwarves abandoned Rookwarden. Bugbears, goblins, and wargs, under the banner of the Warg Queen, overran the Rookwarden Fells. The settlement of Artoum first formed around a large keep built by Lord Drellis Artoum in 4672, when the nobleman's family and retainers fled the people's revolt in Andoran. After successfully organizing local ranchers to coordinate their defense against bandit raids, he eventually proclaimed himself king, a social reach he further cemented by granting lands and titles to those swearing fealty to him. Later that same year, Lord Rasmir, the so-called living god, established the kingdom of Rasmir and founded his capital city of Thronestep, conquering the entirety of the Archduchy of Melkat. In the subsequent 2 years, the triunes of Lambeth suffered exactly the fate they feared, as Rasmir looked towards their little fiefdom for conquest. The triunes' wealth and influence failed them, as the faceless cultists seemed immune to graft, and infiltrators could make no headway against the ruthless mental conditioning of Rasmir and acolytes. The other river kingdoms were marshalling their own defense against this new threat, and had little succor to give, and soon Lambeth was itself being infiltrated by provocateurs from Rasmuran, from humble mendicants spreading the word of generosity of the living god, to poisoners and assassins the equal of any in Daggermark. Hemmed in and desperate, the triunes were unexpectedly visited by an exiled Andoran knight named Camden Arnifax. Marshalling his own household guards with Lambeth's piecemeal army and refugees from the fallen kingdoms, Arnifax added not only mercenaries brought with triune coin, but shadow beasts and hellspawn from the infernal reaches. Astride nightmare steeds and flanked by packs of shadow hounds, Arnifax and his personal guard, backed by the infamous cat's paw marauders of Ustalav, launched a devastating sneak attack upon Razmirin's armies, slaughtering their officers while his riverfolk crossed the Selen by night. The Razmiri camp became a killing field, with precious few escaping the slaughter, and in Lambeth, this victory is still celebrated every 26th of Calistral as the Moonlight Massacre of 4675. The elated triunes prepared a welcome celebration in Machinel, but when Master Tander Cullerton suggested a delay in the recognition of Arnifax's lordship, the knight coolly snapped the man's neck with his bare hands. Lady Cullerton swiftly met the same fate when she rushed to her fallen husband's side. Over their corpses, Arnifax proclaimed, "Betrayal is a crime, and any crime must be punished twice, once for a lesson learned and once for a lesson remembered. Remember always who rules in Lambeth." The Angelidis and Viscara families both swore fealty at once, while the Cullertons were dispossessed and exiled under penalty of death. In 4673, Abidus Nozzle, a wealthy bank owner from the Galton city of Edme, fled Galt when his bank was forcibly taken over by revolutionaries. He gathered with him as many friends and other misplaced noblemen as he could find, and together they sought a new land to call their own, away from the madness of the Red Revolution. They found it in the River Kingdoms, a small piece of land bisected by the Selen River. Nozzle became the mayor of this new town, and he set to work expanding and defending it. As the city grew, things quickly fell out of Nozzle's control, as he was not prepared to rule what was rapidly becoming a small kingdom. In response to the complaints, he appointed an advisory council, and they effectively ruled Little Galt until Nozzle's death 2 years later. The council appointed a new leader, an ambitious man named Hanan Gralt. Under his rule, Little Galt was renamed Gralton, mostly by ex-noblemen who found the name Little Galt to be demeaning. And since then the governor and the council have shared somewhat equal rule over the city-state. In 4687, brigands began raiding Gralton. Hanan Gralt died in the attack, and the advisory council appointed Marnius Chellorn as the governor of Gralton. Later, in 4687, hostilities between Miéville and Pitax flared anew, and Mivoni sword lord Rastone Selene made his name putting down the raiders and forging a peace with Pitax. In 4689, revolutionary Achille Parsal, the young knight, founded Liberthane, just south of the East Selen River. The young noble-born Achille despaired for Galt and for the cause of liberty, until he was inspired by a fiery speech from a cleric of Melani, who spoke of the power of hope and the struggle of freedom. Achille pledged himself to the Church of Melani. He spent the next 20 years championing oppressed people everywhere. As he moved into middle age, however, he realized he could not lead with his sword forever, and his homeland of Galt still suffered. This led him to the River Kingdoms, where he could light a beacon of liberty near Galt and do what he could to save his homeland. He led a score of followers into the River Kingdoms and seized a rundown fortress from a notorious bandit. Renaming the place Liberthane, he began recruiting young idealists to his cause, swearing to free Galt or die trying. After repeated disagreements with the Outlaw Council, King Drellus of Artoum fell victim to dagger-marked poisoners in 4690. His wife, Queen Savella, left the kingdom in the hands of Sir Branson Wake, a visiting Templar and veteran of the Mandevian Crusades, to serve as regent until she could give birth to Artoum's son. Unknown to Savella, however, the duplicitous Wake forsook his crusader's oath and led his men to abandon the front lines of the Worldwound and find fortune elsewhere. After publicly gaining authority over Artoum, Wake secretly tried to assassinate the queen and blame it on Daggermark. Savella escaped, and now raises her son Edred in hiding until she can prepare him to reclaim his father's crown. In the summer of 4693, a wealthy Taldan prospector named Loric led an expedition up the Wyvern Kill, seeking the legendary mineral riches supposedly contained within the region's gorges. He lost a third of his men to a goblin assault before the second night had passed. Enraged, he spent his family fortune equipping a small mercenary army for the sole purpose of exterminating the goblins. For 6 years, Loric scoured the fells, all the while mocked for a fool in the courts of the River Kingdoms, but Loric appeared each year in the Outlaw Council, throwing down the standards of slain goblin chieftains before the assembled rulers. Though he had not yet found Rookwarden, nor faced the Warg Queen, he began to earn a measure of respect from the council. In the 7th year of Loric's crusade, the Outlaw Council acknowledged his rule over the region, consenting to call the wilderness region the Loric Fells. Later that same year, the immortal champion Maldar Taimon took on his latest guise, that of the half-orc warrior king named Ulorth Ungin, who became the latest exalted champion and the ruler of the nation he founded 2,500 years ago. In 4699, General Cabal Voran staged a coup against King Avon II, whose father had established the fledgling river kingdom only half a century earlier. The general's insurrection was successful, and he established a military dictatorship in Teyvat. Uniquely, he was particularly displeased with the power that the clergy had had in his lands, and he expelled all churches from the kingdom. All priests and clerics were given 30 days to leave under threat of death. The few who tried to remain were publicly flogged, their bloody bodies tied to carriages and driven through the streets of the capital, where the people threw rocks at their heads and burned their holy books. Today, Teyvat is a miniature Rahadum, and no divine magic is practiced here. In 4700, the Chelish corsair prince Morgan the White, thereafter called the White Marquis, gathered every pirate ally he had from the Shackles to Riddleport, and he convinced them to retire to a choice piece of land astride a tributary of the Selyn River in the northern reaches of the River Kingdoms. With these fellow pirates, he created a complicated protection racket known as the Pirate Pact, established through the Marquis Convention, a loose contract of obligations and rules, and he crowned himself the White Marquis of an area called the Protectorate of the White Marquis. In 4071, Lord Lorik of the Lorik Fells and his mercenary army were ambushed and slain by Scrags, opening Lorik Fells to the speculations of would-be bandit kings. Today, it remains a land without a ruler. In 4702, Pitax would change forever, with the arrival of a Numerian bard named Castruccio Iravetti. With a silver tongue and a sack filled with gold coins, Iravetti bought most of the trading houses in Pitax and managed to talk his way into a profitable partnership with the rival merchants of the Liasenza family. On one fateful evening, Iravetti invited the leaders of the Liasenza name, the brothers Lothair and Berengar, warriors renowned for their skill with the rapier, to a card game at one of his warehouses. Somehow, no one present could later recollect the events of that card game, or any part of that strange evening. However, when the sun rose the next morning, Iravetti owned a signed document, legally handing over all possessions of the Liasenza family to him, including the crown of Pitax. Hoping to give Pitax the illusion of respectability, Iravetti formed the Academy of Grand Arts shortly after taking over, hoping to turn the small city into a bastion of fine art and high culture. Unfortunately, this plan proved to be disastrous. Iravetti insisted on carefully controlling whatever the various artists, musicians, actors, and other performers of the Academy created or did. As a result, the talented sorts that Iravetti hoped to attract never came, instead leaving only those with limited talents and great delusions of grandeur to enter its gates. In 4703, the success of Morgan the White inevitably led to his downfall, as one of his strongest allies, a Vudran Maharaja buccaneer, slew the White Marquis in his sleep and usurped power in a bloody coup. Though his name is not remembered, this despot styled himself the Crimson Marquis and led for a brief period before a half-orc ally of the White Marquis named Ultrar Duneshifter, who took power as the Rogue Marquis, jailed him. These events, piled so quickly one on top of the other, destabilized the Pirate Pact, and for several years the region devolved into thievery and chaos. In 4706, foreign mercenaries, led by a man known only as Petchki, took over the village of Bakelgrui in Cordelon. The people there have been conscripted into hard labor, for Petchki's men killed Chief Otok and displayed his head in the center of town. Technically, the villagers are not slaves, as Petchki doesn't want to violate the Fifth River freedom and draw bad luck to his operation, but he pays them barely anything and leaves them almost no time to gather food or hunt for themselves. His mercenary teamsters pull wagons of loot to the edge of the wood, where his contacts take the cargo further down the Selyn. Petchki plans to marry one of the dead chief's daughters to further legitimize his rule. This is still the current state of affairs in Bakelgrui. Later, in 4706, the town of Scrawny Crossing was abandoned under mysterious circumstances after a fierce rainstorm. What the nearby kingdoms have yet to discover is that Scrawny Crossing has become the base of operations for a band of aquatic slavers. The denizens here are scrags or sea trolls crossbred with the Ulat Kinney or scum to produce hardier soldier minions for their mysterious masters. This group is led by a trio of monstrous creatures. One of the leaders is an iridescent scaled naga called Lord Slisk. Another is an aberrant scrag sorcerer named Thult Lorth. and the third is a grotesque sea hag known as Mother Slug. Meanwhile, in the pirate protectorate, 3 different marquises all claimed power after the death of the rogue marquis, and ruled from the 3 towns of Deadbridge, Farhaven, and Bodie's Haunt, effectively cutting their branch of the river into 3 different protection rackets. In 4707, one of the residents of Deadbridge, a porcine man from Numeria named Urdul Bazak, decided he'd had enough and made a deal with his home nation that if they could send armies south and smashed Bodie's Haunt for him, he'd reduce the price for all Numerian traffic on the river. The Numerians reluctantly agreed, and while Bazak sat astride his horse on a nearby hilltop, he watched as the Marquis of Bodie's Haunt was drawn and quartered, and the entirety of his community was slain. He immediately sent word to the Marquises of Farhaven and Deadbridge that the same was about to happen to them, and in a matter of weeks he became the Black Marquis, the current enforcer of the Pirate Pact. In 4708, Lord Martro Livendar became the new Lord of Daggermark, promising an era of reconstruction and glory, and surviving 5 assassination attempts, 3 in his first week. These assassination attempts stopped when he declared he now was also the Lord Captain of the city's cavalry, making him exempt from assassination. He is still the current ruler. In 4710, the events of the Kingmaker adventure path take place. In this adventure, the heroes travel south from Brevoy and enter the region called the Stolen Lands. After seizing control of a fort belonging to a local bandit king called the Stag Lord, they establish a new kingdom in the land. In the course of these events, they end up at war with Pitax, and as a result, Castruccio Irivetti is either killed, overthrown, and captured, or escapes into exile. Either way, there is canonically a new leader in Pitax as of 2nd edition, but he has not been named yet, though it is likely that surviving heirs of either the Catanei or Liacenza noble families have since reclaimed the kingdom. This adventure culminates with an invasion from the First World, the realm of the Fae, but the heroes prevent this and manage to secure the Stolen Lands as a new and powerful member state of the River Kingdoms. In 4716, the events of the Iron Gods adventure path take place, and the Technic League is defeated in Numeria. According to Pathfinder 2nd Edition World Guide, since then, Numeria's government, which was never truly organized to begin with, has almost entirely dissolved. Numeria does not currently engage in any formal diplomacy, although it is likely some remnants of the Technic League can still be found and may still hold pockets of influence in some places. This brings us to current day. The River Kingdoms today. The River Kingdoms are a collection of often fractious neighbors united only by their common geography and their near anarchic independence. When the local lord may change from year to year, the nearest king is actually a bandit with delusions of grandeur, and the only thing protecting a rancher's livestock is how well he can use a sword, the strong learn to depend on themselves and distrust those who break their word or exploit others. Though the leaders of the River Kingdoms are varied and ever-changing, the people, as stubborn and contrary as they may be, mark the character of the River Kingdoms: survivalist adaptability and stubborn endurance. Frequently invoked and occasionally trampled, the river freedoms are the ideological backbone for common riverfolk. Those who expect to lead in the River Kingdoms must quickly make themselves aware of the subtleties of the river freedoms, as those leaders who repeatedly flout a beloved freedom find themselves deposed by a mob. The freedoms were enshrined in Daggermark in 4619 after the death of one of their many monarchs. The freedoms are: Number 1. Say what you will, I live free. The freedom to speak is not the same as freedom from consequences of speech. Outsiders, drunkards, and fools are the only ones who vocally invoke this freedom. All others respect it and live with it accordingly. Still, criticism of government is more common here than in other lands. Cruel despots occasionally get an earful from their subjects, and the wise ones do not harshly punish such vocal rabble. In the River Kingdoms, leaders' respect is earned by withstanding criticism, rather than suppressing it. Number 2. Oathbreakers die. The flip side of free speech in the River Kingdoms is the gravity of oath-breaking. Petty liars are common, but in a land where tomorrow can bring a gang of mercenaries, the people in charge must know whom they can trust. It is said, riverfolk who undertake oaths keep them or die trying. Number 3. Walk any road, float any river. This freedom implies no safety while traveling, especially from the local lord. It merely prevents lords from blocking land and water travel, or charging tolls for passing, except to non-river folk, of course. In practice, it means no lord can take his or her people for granted. Most river folk do not leave their homes for anything but essential travel, no matter who is in charge, and poor river folk usually have nowhere else to go, but they might still move to a new kingdom if their lord is too abusive. Number 4. Courts are for kings. Buried midway down this list is one that undergirds them all. Law within the river kingdom is malleable, and the rulers of a kingdom do as they wish. In their lands one must obey. Whether a visitor is a commoner or a neighboring king, all are subject to a lord's law within his own territory, and anyone who disobeys must be prepared for punishment or a declaration of war. As a result, rulers seldom visit each other directly. Intermediaries often do the talking, even when lords are scant miles away. The major exception, of course, is the yearly Outlaw Council, where the meeting hall is considered politically neutral ground. Number 5. Slavery is an abomination. Nothing is so secure in the river kingdoms as freedom for escaped slaves. Unlike Andorans, river folk won't leave their homes to free slaves, but a runaway in the river kingdoms is a slave no more. River folk welcome thousands of escaped slaves to all kingdoms each year to fill ranks in armies and agriculture. Escaped slaves are usually the fiercest proponents of the river freedoms, as these conventions are the first taste of freedom in their new lives. Number 6. You have what you hold. In contrast to many other civilizations in Golarion, this freedom draws a moral distinction between robbery and theft. Taking something by force is considered a lesser crime. Burglary, on the other hand, is punishable under common law. The difference is in allowing a victim the ability to resist, the opportunity to face his or her robber, and to plan for repossession, if so desired. This allows for a rough honesty, letting riverfolk know and face their enemies. Popular religious faiths in the region are, not surprisingly, worship of Erastil the Elk Father, who watches over farms, families, and simple communities. But also Desna, Calistria, and Caden Calian all see a good deal of worship. So too do the evil gods Norgorber and Lamashtu, and the river kingdoms are home to many strange cults, some of which actually have a source of magic behind them. The elves say the magic of the land responds to belief, and many local tales tell of mysterious creatures of the woods who can grant boons in exchange for sworn oaths or devotion. Worship of the Fey pantheon, known as the Eldest, is also fairly common in the river kingdoms. There are also a couple of popular local divinities, and the best known are Girona and Hanspur. Hanspur is covered in more detail in my Lesser Gods of Golarion Part 2 video, while Girona is a hag goddess, famously worshipped by the Black Sisters that destroyed the city of Habar. Although fractious, the High Lords of the River Kingdoms recognize the value of having common cause against Avastan's more powerful factions. For this reason, there is a kind of shared government among the River Kingdoms in the form of the Outlaw Council. Rulers from all kingdoms are invited to attend this yearly council in Daggermark, but only lords from Daggermark, Gralton, Lambeth, Mivan, Pitax, the Protectorate of the Black Marquis, Seven Arches, Timon, and perhaps now the new king or queen of the Stolen Lands are truly respected. Other kingdoms are considered too transient to merit full consideration in the proceedings, though, in the spirit of unity, they are allowed to attend. Unlike in other meetings, mere representatives are not allowed to speak. A lord must attend personally to have a voice. Topics of yearly discourse include negotiating treaties, defense against mutual threats, food distribution, recognition of sovereignty, and solving smaller interpersonal matters before they become armed conflicts. The meeting hall where the Outlaw Council gathers is considered neutral territory. No king rules any other here, even Livandar, Lord of Daggermark. Finally, let's talk about life for the common people. The River Kingdoms has been split into more than 24 sovereign realms since the fall of the Taldan Empire, and most of its member states are ruled by despots of varying temperament. Tyrants who raise a keep in the River Kingdoms often hail from surrounding lands, but are almost always cast-offs, criminals, or wayward offspring of more important folk. Most rule by force, though some are gentler than others. Life in the River Kingdoms is harsh. Bandits can attack at any time, local governments shift like riverbanks, invading armies pillage the land, and unexpected monstrous and magical threats occur with alarming frequency. Every family has lost someone to sudden violence. The perilous uncertainty keeps everyone tense, suspicious, and often angry. For the people here, trust is paramount. Anyone unrecognizable is not just a potential threat, but also a potential vanguard for an army of threats. Trust costs more than money, is a common riverfolk aphorism. For all this danger, though, the land is still beautiful and bountiful. Even the marshes and forests are fertile. Raiders, not the land or weather, make farming hard. Wheat, corn, oats, and rice are quick and plentiful crops grown throughout the kingdom. Livestock here grows fat on the rich grasses fed by the hydra-headed tributaries of the Selin River. For those that do find a safe corner, the river kingdoms can be a truly pleasant place to live. The known kingdoms. I'm now going to do a quick run-through of the River Kingdom member states, although since there are so many, and since much of the detail of their history has already been covered in my broader section on the history of the region, I'm just going to briefly touch on each one, focusing on their leader and their current government. I will start from the top and move from left to right as I go. The Protectorate of the Black Marquis. The Protectorate is ruled by Urdul Bazak, the Black Marquis himself, but guided by the principle of shared wealth. Anyone willing to work gets a cut from the protection racket, but the ruling Marquis gets the lion's share. The pirate ships of the Black Marquis ply all the waters of the river kingdoms, sometimes going so far as Lake Carthan or even south of the Callus Lake. Pitax. Prior to its disastrous war with the new sovereign nation of the Stolen Lands in 4710, Pitax was one of the great powers of the river kingdoms. Since then, their former leader King Castruccio Iravetti has either been killed or gone into hiding, and its power and influence is greatly reduced. Despite this, the capital, Pitax City itself, is still a cultural center in the River Kingdoms and continues to prosper in spite of the failing state of the rest of the realm. The Stolen Lands. There is a new king or queen in these lands, ruling from its new and bustling capital along the coast of the Great Tuskwater Lake. Paizo Publishing has yet to provide some context around the canonical future of this newly established kingdom, but presuming the heroes were successful, then this powerful new nation will end up of significant importance, occupying a large tract of territory in the northern expanse of the River Kingdoms and bordering the much larger United Nation of Brevoy. Lambeth. Once ruled by a triune of lords, after the nation was targeted for conquest by neighboring Rasmir, they were saved by a Chelish knight exiled from the former region now called Andoran after their civil war. Lord Camden Arnifax now rules Lambeth from the former Cullerton Manor in Machinal. He is a reclusive lord, often working through his two close allies, a pair of gnome siblings, Master Gardener Senestin Messner, who is responsible for cultivating Lambeth's river blackberries into the labyrinthine thornwort, and Mistress of the Kennels Nevet Messner, who has tamed packs of shadow mastiffs and yeth hounds as guards and hunters. Arnifax's heavy-armored horsemen, known as the feared Black Eagles, roam the realm, usually at night, collecting the taxes, enforcing the law, and defending the people. Arnifax makes frequent nocturnal visits to his borders, riding a powerful nightmare. His people are terrified of his night riders and their shadowy dogs, and yet also strangely proud that their ruler is powerful enough to keep the land free and safe. Daggermark. The City of Assassins is the heart of the region controlled by Daggermark. The inner curtain wall surrounds Dagger Home, a small hill upon which the wealthy of the city maintain their villas and estates. Each neighborhood in the city has a citizen captain who represents the neighborhood and complains to the authorities. The city is home to the Daggermark Assassins Guild, a school for the Yenshabur method of assassination, as well as the Daggermark Poisoners Guild. The former is run by Lady Janna Smilos, a descendant of Galton nobility, and the latter is run by Tragshi the Herbalist, an elderly half-elf with golden tan skin who hails from lands far to the east and wanders the city with dozens of venomous snakes crawling about her person. The city and country are ruled over by Lord Martro Livendar, who doubles as commander of the city cavalry as a way of avoiding assassination based on the land's strange customs that go back decades. Outsea. The sprawling, walled town of Outsea contains streets and canals, with buildings both above and below its waterline. It was built on the site of a pre-existing human settlement, and while much construction has occurred since its founding, some ancient human buildings remain, and are even in use, both above water and submerged. The population includes air breathers of various sentient races, including humans and elves, living in the above-water houses, comprising about 30% of the overall population, but the majority of the city is underwater. As their ancestors were thrust together for survival, the aquatic population combines all sorts of different species forced to work together by circumstance. The towns and its holdings, both terrestrial and aquatic, are ruled by a military democracy headed by the Council of Generals, representing the various sentient water-breathing races of Outsea. Only generals are eligible to stand as candidates. Landlubber outseers vote for an advisory council, which represents their interests to the Council of Generals, making requests and suggestions. The generals are not obliged to act on such input, but often do so, aware that, while they might consider them second class, landlubber outseers are invaluable citizens. This is particularly the case not just with regard to air-breather soldiers, but to the small cadre of outsea heralds who travel overland and through freshwater, operating as ambassadors, scouts, traders, and messengers on outsea's behalf. The Council of Generals, however, may not be the true lord of outsea. The council, in turn, pays homage to the living goddess Danglosa that lives deep in the saltwater tunnels, somewhere below a submerged, coral-overgrown, and reconsecrated human church. A creature born of Abolethie magic, Danglosa is the only inhabitant of Outsea still alive who was on the original raiding party. Everyone knows it's primarily Danglosa's effort that keeps Outsea going, so they continue to worship her. Should the living goddess's magic ever fail, then the fresh water of the river would wipe out most of the water-breathing population. Artoum. Artoum is another small kingdom, where the current situation is fairly dire. Having usurped power from Queen Sovella, who now raises the rightful heir Prince Edred Artoum in exile, Lord Regent Branson Wake and his thugs find themselves increasingly challenged by the rigors of governing. The nearby kingdom of Gralton lures away his best warriors with mercenary pay, even as amphibious Nagas surface along the river to attack barges, keelboats, and watering holes. The snake people grow bolder with each encounter, venturing inland to assault homesteads among the tall grasslands. Rather than deal with these problems, Wake's Templars ride from Artoum's gates to commandeer supplies and collect tribute from the locals. Gralton. Formerly known as Little Galt, Gralton today is ruled by an oligarchy of 6 citizens consisting of the governor and 5 council members. Though the governor is generally considered to be the leader of the council, as he is the public face of Gralton's government, in truth the governor and the council members share power equally. The governor and council members serve for life, barring optional retirement or a majority vote of removal. Council members appoint the new governor and new council members in the case of vacancy. The governor has no official say in the selection of new council members, though he is expected to provide an opinion on the matter. Current Governor Marneus Churlorn is best known for his assistance in Gralton's recovery after brigands set fire to much of northern Gralton. Tuvet. Tuvet is another one of the many unique autocratic kingdoms in the region. For decades, the center of nearly every town and village in Tuvet was a temple. After clearing out the clerics and priests, General Cabal Voran transformed these temples into what he called charities. A Tuvet charity is a combination school, hospital, and government building. The general established his charities, as he said, so his people could thrive. And in some ways, he was successful. The citizens of Tuvet are the most educated in the river kingdoms. 8 out of 10 adults can read and write. If a farmer falls ill, workers from the charity treat him until he is better and work his crops so the village has food for the season. If a blacksmith loses a hand, the charity takes him in, finding work for him so his family doesn't starve. Any and all citizens are free to enter the charity building. Here they learn how to read, write, and count. The charities also organize workers to repair damaged buildings, teach farmers how to plant new crops, and build homes for the homeless. If a storm strikes or monsters invade, the people head to the safety and sanctuary of the charity. If a legal grievance arises, the people go to the charity where a judge, appointed by the general, sits in judgment on the case. Portraits of the general and his great deeds decorate every charity. The charities also train Tuvet soldiers, and all men of adult age are ready to protect the people from external dangers, including adventures with foreign ideals about liberty and justice. Their loyalty to their kingdom is strong, and to the general it is even stronger. Uringen. The unique city of Uringen means that half the town disappears, seemingly at random, going into a fey pocket dimension, only reappearing a few days later. The 2 towns, therefore, operate fairly independently, as Static Town and Unstuck Town. Because of its unique properties, it has become a haven for alchemists, arcanists, and other strange sorts. Most keep to their tasks, working the alchemical labs or providing services for those who do. Inhabitants of Static Town lead a relatively normal existence, though they are always on the lookout for harassment by Fae. The town is orderly and people leave each other to their business. Those dwelling in the static side of town rarely do business in the unstuck portion, for fear of being whisked away. When they do venture in, they make their visits short. Residents of unstuck Uringen are a more casual sort, welcoming their haphazard life. A large volume of the population is gnomish here, who enjoy the random nature of their lives. While hard work constructing curatives and alchemical goods goes on in this side of town, the taverns are typically filled with gregarious patrons who carry on in a festive manner. As Uringen maintains a unique dual nature, each portion of the town has its own mayor. The kingdom operates as an autocratic diarchy, with each mayor looking after those in their own domain. Lord Mayor Navar Miran oversees Static Town and protects any nearby encampments and maintains a relationship with the Embeth camps, the nomadic people of the Embeth Forest, who are led by the woodsman, Captain Jamel Visser. Lady Mayor Aurelia Ogden and her pixie companion Serotius, who provides fey insight into the vanishing settlement, actively attempt new experiments to rectify the settlement's unique condition. Lady Ogden leaves most of the mundane duties to her sheriff, Lugaid Ibarra. Both mayors meet once a year prior to the Outlaw Council to determine who will represent the kingdom. This decision, although prefaced by debate and attempts at guile, more often than not falls to a game of chance, such as dice or cards. Miéville. The Aldori, exiled Brevik lords from the subsumed state of Rossland, have brought their love of dueling to Miéville, and there they have formalized its status. The basis of Miéville's current society is the List of Suitors, a monthly publication that lists the results of the previous month's duels. Fortunes rise and fall on the basis of a duel, governmental positions are won or lost, and scores are settled with a quick thrust or lunge. Additionally, the central square of Miéville hosts the Sevier, a weekly gathering for duelists who wish to prove themselves in public. They simply appear, present themselves to the judges, and proclaim whom they wish to duel. Duels are usually not held without formal insults, and thus it is customary that a participant in the Sevier studies the list of names, calculates an insult, and delivers it within earshot of at least 2 witnesses. The leadership of Miéville is commonly held to be a meritocracy. The Aldori sword lord Raston Celine is the titular mayor of the city, guiding Miéville through the treacherous waters of the River Kingdom politics. He claims that the city will pass to the hands of whoever can defeat him in a fair contest. First, though, a challenger must pass the gauntlet of the lesser lords of Miéville, fighting his way up the list of suitors. Sword Lord Celine seems genteel enough, and is even a bit of a gossip. It's said that nothing passes in the salons and streets of the city without his knowledge, and he frequently lets drop juicy tidbits regarding his rivals and up-and-coming duelists. He is proud of his network of informants, and whether it is as pervasive as he claims, or this is mental trickery, none can or will say. As Sword Lord Celine grows older, one of his compatriots, a younger sword lord of devastating skill named Gaspar Telek, has voluntarily declared himself Celine's inferior, and thus anyone wishing to take the city's government must first pass through Telek. This allows Celine to teach Telek how to manipulate the hidden strings of the city and its intrigues, and how to deal with troublesome interlopers. The city whispers that Telek will strike out at Celine sometime soon, but for now they keep their friendship public and ostensibly tension-free. Timon. When visitors enter the city-state of Timon, they more than likely hear the roar of the crowd coming from its famous gladiatorial arena as its eager fans cheer their favorite gladiator on to victory. The city's gladiatorial college churns out some of the best fighters in Avestan, and they test their mettle on the arena's floor for money, honor, and fame. But with the country of Razmiran at its doorstep and the faithful of the living god constantly harassing Timon's borders, there is an uneasy tension floating beneath the bloodsport that has made the town famous. It should be no surprise that Timon, founded from a battalion of arena fighters, has a single leader, the Exalted Champion. The militaristic style of rule suits those hardened in the forges of the arena, and the rules of law are simple, pragmatic, and harsh to those who disobey them. Maldar created the 4 rules of law to govern his kingdom, and no additional laws could change or reverse the original 4. These were the Law of Blood, that established a unique form of nobility called the Bloodied. A fighter is considered bloodied when he has won 10 battles in the arena. Only bloodied fighters can own land, carry open weapons, or own businesses in Timon. The Law of Defense. The Law of Defense makes it mandatory for all bloodied warriors in Timon to rally to the defense of the kingdom whenever it is attacked from the outside. The Law of Grievance. Any person who has a grievance that cannot be settled to his satisfaction through traditional means can challenge his offender to a duel in the arena to decide the dispute. The Law of Succession. As already described, Any fighter who has won 100 battles can challenge the champion to a one-on-one duel to the death, with the winner becoming the new champion. The current exalted champion is a half-orc named Ulorth Ungin, but few suspect the secret truth of Timon's champion, that it is in fact the city's legendary founder, reincarnated over and over again, thanks to a long-standing compact with the Druids of Seven Arches. Seven Arches. Life in Seven Arches is less civilized than in other river kingdoms. Settlements are small, rough, and fortified. The Oak Stewards are the rulers of Seven Arches and lead with a hand that is alternately detached and heavy. The Druids seem unmoved by cries of human injustice, but act quickly to defend land and citizens against despoilers, springing from within the trees themselves to prevent harm to their realm. The Oak Stewards operate in infuriating secrecy, often keeping silent even when communication would help their cause. 4 roles among the Druids alone communicate with the outside world, chosen each year during the winter solstice. The voice of the wind serves as the speaker to outsiders, and the foreign affairs diplomat. The root of the sapling encourages growth of crops and children. The bloom of the harvest ensures proper food distribution to Seven Arches residents and foreign buyers. The sharp of the bark defends the borders, waters, and roads of Seven Arches. There are more than 4 stewards, however, and probably more positions that the Druids hold internally, though the Druids share no further information on this topic. The revolving nature of the Oak Stewards' governance makes it difficult for outsiders to build relationships. A different voice of the wind attends every outlaw council. Policy remains consistent, but the different Druids have displayed wildly varying diplomatic abilities. The Oak Stewards meet and confer in a secret lodge in the Elderwoods. The lodge exists within a series of enormous ancient oak trees, joined via branches and other growths to create one great internal room. According to the elves of Severian, Seven Arches was once elven land, in a time long forgotten, and because of various attempts to reclaim the land, the Druids and Fae of Seven Arches no longer welcome the elves into their kingdom. Any elf visitor in this land must have an escort who can vouch for them, and breach of law or suspected espionage during their stay is usually met with swift exile or even death. Cordelon. Chief Saylock the Half-Elven is the Lord of Cordelon, the descendant of Himbrian elves who abandoned this place long ago in favor of their more deeply wooded kingdom in the west when the war with Seven Arches ended. The capital city of Novaboro, built by elves who used it as a staging place and military outpost, lies behind a fortified stone wall on the riverside. It boasts a dozen buildings made of timber and a 2-story stone tower overlooking the river, with keen-eyed archers watching for approaching hostiles. The place is starting to become a neutral trading post, and painted markers or trees bearing the village's tattered crow banner mark the path to the village. The locals are superstitious about the many crows that nest here, and killing crows in town is a crime punishable by death. Beyond the capital, Chief Saylock's rule and protection is questioned, as he has permitted the second largest city in the region, Bakul Grui, to be conquered by foreign mercenaries. Boss Petchke now rules that city, creating disunity in the land. Himbria. The small nation-state of Himbria is not technically a member state of the River Kingdoms, although it acts like one and even sends an envoy to the Outlaw Council, but it is technically a small colony of the elven nation of Kionin. Himbria's current leader is Feriel Nelmir, an elf who has proven quite adept at balancing the various factions within and beyond Himbria. The elven fighters who protect the boundaries of the forest, the solitary rangers who patrol it, the druids who nurture the plants and creatures that bring Himbria her fortune and notoriety, the various riverfolk who travel the Selin to do business with Himbria, and the elves of Kionin, whose hold on the outpost is becoming increasingly tenuous. Kionin is in part to blame for the state of affairs, due to the practice of sending restless fighters and troublesome rogues to swell Feriel's ranks. To say that Himbria is a dumping ground for elven criminals and malcontents would be overstating matters, but only slightly. The Himbrian elves are celebrated for their savory, nourishing combinations of dried mushrooms and herbs, unique to this forest, brought from Kionin, and some whisper Severian itself, and cultivated in hidden glades and shadowy fens. The elves also make a potent distilled mead from the honey of bees who feed upon these exotic plants. It's enjoyed by the Himbrian natives, but not well tolerated by other races, including foreign elves who haven't been exposed to the forest's rare plants. A small amount can be more debilitating than several mugs of dwarven rotgut, which, for a number of reasons, makes Himbrian mead a popular trade good. In addition to their food and drink, the Himbrian elves have another product line, just as well known but less openly discussed, and this, more than anything else, cements their relationship with the established power structure of the River Kingdoms. They supply the assassins of Daggermark with a wide variety of poisonous mushrooms and herbs, as well as other more exotic tools for discreet killings. The Himbrian elves are not as malicious as the drow, but they are certainly more nefarious than the rest of their kin, and are increasingly a breed apart from other elves. Liberthane. Liberthane is a glimmer of hope and idealism in the cutthroat milieu of the River Kingdoms. From here, an old revolutionary continues his fight for justice, his passion undimmed by the terror in his homeland of Galt. Sir Achille Parsal, a knight of Milani, runs Liberthane as a military protectorate. Those who choose to live here must obey his orders, as he and his soldiers are what keeps them safe, but they are otherwise allowed more freedoms than in most places. Any common folk or even exiled Galtan nobles who wish to build farms in the surrounding hills can do so with protection from Parcel's knights, provided they pay an appropriate tax for the safety of the countryside. This amounts to not much different a system than conventional serfdom, except for the freedom to establish new farmlands in the region. However, people here do seem happier than elsewhere. Parsal also welcomes adventurers with good hearts and the courage to stand up for hope and redemption, particularly followers of Iomade, Milani, and Sarenrae. The Unclaimed Lands. Now let's take a quick look at the unclaimed lands of the River Kingdoms, where bandit lords and would-be kings can grab some land and make a name for themselves. The Echo Wood. The towns of Mosswater and Scrawny Crossing now lie abandoned, laid to waste by monstrous creatures that dwell in the dangerous rapids that run through the Juveler Hills. Across the Sellen, the haunted Ustalavi hold of Bastard Hall in the province of Varno keeps the dangers of Mosswater and the hills at bay, but east of this, few human settlements remain. An ambitious lord could tame these lands and make a real name for themselves here. Also, somewhere deep in these woods, it is believed there are the ruins of a civilization of Aslanti exiles, although none can point exactly to where. Such a find would make an adventurer very wealthy indeed. Lorick Fells. The abandoned dwarf fortress of Rookwarden can be found in Lorick Fells. The former lord of the Fells, Sir Lorick himself, was slain by the Fells' new masters, a coven of green hags. Many wish to follow in his footsteps, though, for the land is as rich as it is dangerous. Some dwarves, too, seek to come here to reclaim the lost fortress, abandoned when Taldan Order left the land, as well as hoping to reclaim the lost dwarven treasures said to be buried there. Emberbow Forest. Once an important prefecture in the old Taldan reckoning, the Emberbow was once the location of the thriving capital city of Habar. The great ruin of Habar, despoiled as it was by the Sisters of Girona, is a thing of legend in the River Kingdoms. Now, only a few wary hamlets hug the edges of the Emberbow, with no lord to unify them or army to protect them. The East Sellen Wilds. South of Cordelon and Himbria, but north of the borders of Galt, is an untamed region that has existed as a kind of no-man's land since the elves pushed the Taldans out of Keonan and captured modern Himbria. As the Himbrians gathered more and more tightly around their new capital of Mimir, they left these lands abandoned, as they did with Cordelon. For their part, the half-elven lords of Cordelon have their own internal strife to deal with, so the East Sellen Wilds have become open for the taking. The Embeth Forest. Although the city of Uringen and the Embeth nomads can be found in this region, the truth is that neither really exerts any control over the surrounding region, and a new kingdom could easily be made here, uniting the smaller hamlets that feel Uringen is too strange a city to be a central authority in the region. On the far southern reach of the forest is a small village of some note called Gristmill, because of its sizable mill, which also serves as the front for Pathfinder venture captain Sarin Firewain's Pathfinder Lodge, called the Grey Falls Lodge. Using this as a home base, an enterprising crew of adventurers could easily establish a new kingdom in the area. The Creeperwood. Finally, there is the Creeperwood. Decades ago, this was the kingdom of Nistra, ruled over by powerful silk merchants. However, in the intervening years, the merchants have been wiped out by the silk goyles they subjugated. It is possible that with the right team someone might reclaim the vast wealth of the Nistran Silk Lords, but far more likely is death in that endeavor, as the land is now crawling with creeper zombies, and fiercely protected by the Silk Goyles themselves, who hate all humans with a fervent passion.